So we're going to be talking a bit about CSS Layout and Grid. We'll talk a little bit about Flexbox as well. And again, we are definitely big fans of video on and interactive. So if you can turn your video on, have the bandwidth to do so, it's much more engaging, fun for us. So always prefer that. What are we going to try to do? We're going to use some layouts in CSS. Particularly, we're going to talk about Flexbox and Grid. We're going to build some layouts with Flexbox and Grid, specifically Grid, because truth be told, if you're using Flexbox to lay out your entire web application, you're doing it wrong. Grid's been around for a while, and Grid is way more ideal for laying things out when you just want a column-related layout. So we'll talk a little bit about how we used to do things, how we kind of evolved, and we'll talk a little bit about responsiveness in our layouts. So nothing too crazy here in the scheme of things. We'll really try to just get you comfortable with the ideas and, even more importantly, the tooling, so that when you look at something like a grid and you look at this and you wonder, how can I change things? Your first inclination is, let me go ahead and open up the Chrome DevTools. Let me go to the Elements tab. Let me click on this grid button and let me get a visualization of what my grid looks like. The tooling here is really the most important thing. If your pattern of writing CSS is write some code, refresh the page, write some code, refresh the page, go back and forth, you want to really try to minimize the context switching that you have, because it's not until you get some tool where you can just start playing around and discover what these things actually do and what happens when you decide to do things like take a particular element and add a grid column and now say this is column 3, or this goes from 1 until 3. And now all of a sudden, you can start seeing things move around. You can start to actually explore what these things mean. This is where we'll talk a lot about the tooling side of things, where having a visualization of what your grid looks like is an invaluable tool, helping to understand what these numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, what does -1 refer to? As I look at the grid, what does 2 refer to right here? And so on. So we'll really try our best to clear up any kind of confusion and so on, but really just expose you to the tooling around getting comfortable with layouts, because the hardest part of CSS is just guessing and checking. And the less guessing and checking you can do, the more you can actually learn what's going on under the hood. What's the idea? We want our layouts to be logical. We want our layouts to be maintainable, and we want them to be responsive. So when we think about laying out a web page, when we think about building web pages, we want it to feel relatively logical. Why is this thing going in the place that it is? Why is this box appearing at a certain part of the page? Because if it's not logical, it's really hard to go to the next point, which is the maintainable side of things. Someone leaves the company, you have no idea why they did anything, or nobody understands how Grid really works, so you can't maintain it super well. On top of that, we want our layouts to be responsive. So as we shift to different screen sizes, we're building an application maybe mostly for phones, but we want it to work on desktop, or we're building something for desktop and we want it to also work on phones. This idea of responsive design has been around for a long time and is mission critical when building web applications, because everybody views applications on different screen sizes. How we used to do things way back in the day, we used to use tools like floats as well as position, which is a property in CSS where you can position things on the page. We still do use positioning a bit, but really nowhere near as much as we used to. So just to show you a little bit of how we kind of used to do things, we'll share all these demos with you at the end. I have this kind of old ways of doing things, and I'm going to just keep my DevTools at the bottom so we don't kind of get in too much trouble here. What you are looking at here is a column layout. I want a first column, I want a second column, I want a third column, I want a fourth column. The way that we did this way back in the day, and if you're still doing this, that's okay, but there are just much better ways to do it. We used a property called float. And float was basically the idea of push something to one side of the page. So float this to the left and float this to the right. And then make sure that under that you clear everything so that you can float this one right here to the left and float this one to the right, and make sure that after this row you clear everything, so if you start adding things it appears as a new row. This idea of floating is how things sort of worked, but then as responsive design came into play, things start getting a little bit trickier. So, well, this is now taking up a little too much, so maybe I'll try to adjust the width. And then I start kind of changing the widths, and then as it gets a little bit more responsive, this breaks again. So floats are a way that we used to do things, but Not anymore. Floats are extremely rigid, and there's just much better ways of doing things. So if you come across this kind of lay out your web page using floats, that is incredibly, incredibly outdated. Something you might see a little bit more commonly is Flexbox, and Flexbox stands for literally flexible boxes. So how can we move things on different parts of the page on an x-axis or a y-axis? How can we center things vertically, horizontally? Flexbox still has a lot of value, but it's really not the easiest tool for building grid-related systems. When we think about grid-related systems, we're thinking about rows and columns. And for most web pages that you interact with, rows and columns are the usual interface that you will see. So if you go to, a web page, I'm just going to go to JavaScript info, we can see that it is very much rows and columns. This right here is one row that takes up the equivalent of 3 columns. This is one column here. This is one column here. This is one column here. If I go take a look at an individual page, this right here is one column. This right here is the rest of those columns. And the text here takes up the rest of the row. If you go to a particular web page, you will see also rows and columns. This right here on the left-hand side is a column. This right here is a column. And here we've got some white space. This idea of row and column layout is extremely, extremely common. When you have rows and columns that are different heights, different widths, and so on, that's where things can get a little bit trickier. But still, at the end of the day, it's really just one column and one column with some different syntax. So as you look at pretty much most web pages that you will visit, you're going to see lots of rows and columns, lots of columns. This whole section, one column. This whole section, one column. This whole section, one column. This whole section, one row that takes up all of the available columns. So in order to think about web pages on a row and column basis, you're going to be using the latest and greatest. And the latest and greatest is in, 6 years ago at this point, CSS Grid. Grid sometimes seems a bit tricky to start, and there's so many different ways of doing things. The good news about Grid is there are 3 different ways of achieving the same exact thing. And all you got to do is just be relatively comfortable with one of them, and the rest of them will translate. So what we're going to be doing is we are going to be taking this kind of float layout that we had that was old and a bit janky, and we're going to turn it into something that looks like this. We're going to have a column layout that spans 2 columns regardless of the screen size. And we're going to see how we can change the size of these columns. In order to do this, we're going to use CSS Grid. And we're going to recommend you do that too. Use Flexbox for centering vertically, centering horizontally, spacing between things. But CSS Grid is really going to be the tool that you use for building out your layouts. On top of that, use the Chrome DevTools. They're going to be super, super, super helpful. In order to work with CSS Grid, I'm just going to show you at a high level what my code looks like. The good news is, in my new ways demo, I don't really have a lot of HTML. I don't actually need any of this. This is just some nice boilerplate. So the thing that really matters is this right here. I'm making a div as an element to contain my container. And I'm giving this a class of grid container. This idea of having a parent element and child elements, super common with any kind of semantic HTML design. Taking a look at the CSS here. These column first, second, third, fourth, I'm just giving them a different background color. So the CSS here is really just to give them different colors. Here is where the fun part starts. I've given these divs a height because if I don't give them a height visually, it's going to look a little bit strange. So just to show you, if these don't have a height, it's not going to look great. So I've just given them a height to kind of give them some visual effect. When you want to play around with this kind of stuff, it might sound a bit primitive, but the easiest way to see where things are on the page is to actually just give things a border. is the, the CSS debugging technique we've used since 1994. If you want to see where something is on a page, just give it a border and you can see where it is and why it is there. So in this case, I'm just giving it some height so that it doesn't appear too finicky, giving it some margin so that everything is not completely next to each other. So I can have a little bit of breathing room. So this margin is the white space that we can see right here. Again, Chrome DevTools for the win. I don't have to hop back to my editor. I can just stay within the Elements tab in the Chrome DevTools. So really nice to just use the Elements tab for each of my elements on the page. What styles are being applied? What does the margin, border, padding, width, and height look like? This is also called the box model. Everything starts by adding display of grid. If I don't have display of grid, then these are just regular divs that stack on each other. So display grid is the thing you add to a parent element to create a grid. This could be for a part of the page. This could be for the entire page. Maybe you have a layout and then inside you have a subgrid. That's totally fine. When you create your grid, you pick how many columns and how many rows. You can let the rows be automatically decided, or you can choose how many rows that you want. In this case, I'm letting the rows be decided, and you will actually find yourself doing that more commonly because the columns will kind of dictate the rows. The key CSS property you want is grid template columns. And the best part when you use the Chrome DevTools, you can even hover over and it will tell you. Specifies as a space-separated track list the line names and tracking size functions of the grid. Not the most helpful. What this is basically saying is, how many columns do you want? And how should I, the browser, determine the size of those columns? The most common way of doing this is by adding a unit called FR. FR stands for fraction. If I have 2 of these FR units, that means give me 2 equal size columns, each spanning 1/2. If I change this to 3 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR, I will get 3 columns. Change this to 4, I'll get 4 columns. Change this to 5, I'll get 5 columns. These are evenly divided fractions. I don't have to do the math. If I change this to 2 FR, 1 FR, I will still have 2 columns, but this will take 2 of the total size as a fraction. 2 plus 1 is 3. 2 divided by 3 is 2/3. This takes up 2/3. If I make this 2 FR, it's the same as doing 1 FR and 1 FR. So you really won't find yourself keeping these numbers all the same aside from 1. But this is how you can dictate how many columns I want. And notice here, you start getting these numbers 1, 2, and 3 as we add more columns. These numbers are going to be very important for us when we start working with individual items in this grid. So one more time, add the display of grid to the parent of your elements. This can be even on the body if you want the whole thing to be a grid, if you want something inside to be a grid. Here I'm just doing it on a parent div element. Grid template columns. How many columns do I want? Determine the size. You could totally do things like 300 pixels, 300 pixels, 300 pixels, 300 pixels. You're just going to get in a lot of trouble with hard-coded units. So right now, sure, that works, but what happens when the screen size is this right here? Well, now I kind of get this scrolling off experience, which is not very pleasant. You could try to use relative units, I guess 25% and 25%, 25%, 25%. But now I'm fighting with things like margin and spacing and padding and so on. So those percents are not totally accurate. If I just want someone to calculate it for me, use this FR. You might see some people be very lazy and do this right here. Repeat or 1FR. That's the same exact thing. Repeat 1FR 4 times. That is the same exact thing as 1FR, 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 1FR. This right here, same thing as this right here. They are exactly the same. So give me one fraction 4 times. If you want a little bit of spacing in the grid, there's a nice property called grid gap. And you can see right here, visually, this represents the grid gap. You can turn this on and off by clicking that grid button right here. So when you open up the Elements tab, if the browser detects, if Chrome detects that you are using CSS Grid, how does it know? Somewhere you added display of grid. The second you add that, this is going to flash. Keep this open as much as you can because it's really, 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 really helpful. This gives me a nice visualization. I've laid things out into 4 columns. So I go from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, and 4 to 5. You can think of these as spanning 1, 2, 3, and 4. So there are 5 lines in my grid, and from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, and 4 to 5, each of these individual pieces occupy those. We also mentioned grid, template, rows. I can automatically calculate the number of rows. It's not really going to change much for me, but I can also try to make these rows in fractions. It's not going to do much for me now. Unless you know exactly the number of rows that you're going to have, usually just going to let the browser calculate that. The browser is going to detect I have 8 divs right here, and you want me to put 4 columns. So naturally, I will make 2 rows. You don't need to tell me it's 2 rows. I can figure that out myself. Because I can figure out that each of these take up 25% or 1/4 of the grid space. So after 4 of them, I got to make a new row. So don't worry about trying to tell me how many rows I got. I'll figure that out myself. Just to see that on the slides. Grid is an easy way to lay out items in rows and columns. There's a strong parent-child relationship. There's lots of different kinds of syntax that we're going to see in a second. We're going to see a number syntax, a span syntax, an area syntax, and they all do the same thing. The grid is going to guess as best as it can. Like we saw, I don't have to say 2 rows because it can guess that given 8 divs and 4 column widths, I'm going to need 2 rows. Add display grid to the parent. And here's what we're going to talk about next. Grid column and grid row to the children. If I want all of these columns to be equal size and so on, no problem. But if I want to start laying things out in potentially a more interesting way, I can work with these children directly using grid column and grid row. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. On the parent, how many columns, how many rows? On the children, here's the fun part, grid column and grid row. So we start with the parent. Parent element gets a display of grid, some grid columns, and a gap if you want. The gap is just to give us a little bit of breathing room in between. You don't have to have that. I'm just doing that so you can see it visually. On these children, we can change for this specific element how many columns it takes up and how many rows it takes up. If I tell this particular element right here, by default, you're supposed to take up 25%, but you in particular, I want you to start at 1 and go until 3. This is why the numbers here are so valuable. By default, this starts at 1 and goes to 2. In fact, this is assumed. This is given to it. This one starts at 1 and goes to 2. This one right here starts at 2 and goes to 3. This one starts at 3 and goes to 4. This one starts at 4 and goes to 5. But if for some reason I want this particular one to span from 1 until 3, I can do that. And now my layout has changed a little bit. This one particular thing takes up a little bit more, and then we go back to our column layout. So if you have a particular grid and you want to change how many columns one particular thing in the grid takes, actually, let's make this go all the way to 4. Let's make this go all the way to 5. Better yet, I don't know how many column lines there are going to be. So I'm going to say -1. And that basically represents just take up the whole thing. I don't know if there's going to be 2, 3, 4, or 5. I don't know the math. So just give me the whole thing. And now you have one column here, and then everybody else behaves as expected. You could think maybe you're making some kind of banner, some kind of Jumbotron hero image or so on. You want something big right here. No problem. By default, there are always going to be 4 columns, but this one is just a little special. Why is this one special? Because I said go from 1 until the end, represented as 5. But if I want this to be able to be changed, let's say someone all of a sudden says, "Oh, actually, we're going to do a 3-column layout." Now all of a sudden, 5 is not really truthful because they're really only 3. So better to do that if you want to go across the whole number of columns, just do -1. And that way, if this changes, it doesn't make a difference. It's more honest. This is where the Chrome DevTools are fun. Start from 1, go to 2. Okay, that's what it does by default. Go from 1 to 2. Yeah, that looks right. Go from 1 till 3. Cool, no problem. How about 4? How about 5? Obviously, as this goes up, doesn't make a difference. You're just kind of changing nothing. Let's go imagine we want some kind of sidebar here. So the second column is going to be a sidebar, and then I want the third column to go from where it is until the end. Well, this third column starts at 2 and goes until 3. I can confirm that by just saying grid column 2, 3, and nothing changes because it starts at 2 and it goes until 3. But let's make this go until the end. And now maybe I have some kind of hero image up here, and then I have a sidebar, and then I have my main page. Or maybe I have a certain layout where I actually don't want this to go from the beginning. Maybe just go from 2 until 5. And then for the second one that starts there, make this go from the first row and the second row. So grid, row, right now it starts at 2. Can I start it from 1 and go until 2? Now this is in the first row. So you can play around with these elements that you have, essentially by specifying what goes where. This is going to go in the first row and span until the end. Do this to -1 even. I could just do this as 1. Grid column, go from 1. And now I can move it across the page at a different point. So depending on how I want to move things around the page, this is where grid column and grid row can be very helpful. So let's start this one more time. We add a class of grid on a parent element. That kicks off everything. We then specify how many columns do I want. How many columns do I want? Well, in this case, the default layout is going to be 2 columns of equal widths. And as the page changes, it doesn't matter. It's always going to be 50%. If I want a little breathing room, give it a gap. That's helpful visually. If I want 3 columns, no problem. 4 columns, no problem. If I'm feeling lazy, then repeat 4 times the 1 FR unit. Maybe I want a situation where I have 1 column, and then I have a second column right here. Take up 1/3 and take up 2/3. This is totally up to you. This is what the parent decides. I'll make 4 columns. Now you can fine-tune the children. This first column, you're starting at 1 and you're going until 2. That's what you're doing right now out of the box. I can see that. You're starting at 1 and you're going to 2. If I want you to start at 1 and go to 3, cool. Grid column 1, 3, 1, 4, 1, 5. Same thing, 1, -1. Same thing, go until the end. So you can start to see from this that you can lay out web pages quite nicely. You can make your rows, you can make your columns, you can make things have slightly different columns and row heights. I'll show you a nice little example here, where this is what I have. I've got some kind of image and some text associated. I've got some kind of column right here, and then 3 columns on the right. Try to build the intuition of what is on the parent element right now. How many columns does this parent have? Well, we can always look at the DevTools. The parent itself has got 2. Inside of the first child element, I have another grid. So I have a grid inside of this that goes from 1 to 2 on the columns right here. Again, this is assumed. This is defined. This goes from 1 to 2. I know it goes from 1 to 2. How about the rows? Starts at row 1, goes until row 4. How about these over here? How about this div that's got a grid on it? Well, the left part is the image, the right part is the text. So I've got a column grid inside. This is called a subgrid. The parent grid is 1FR, 1FR. This child right here is also 1FR, 1FR. So I can have an image and some text. For this particular child, for these particular properties, no problem. This is first, this is second. How do I know that this takes up 3 rows? Well, right here, I can specify it. I don't have to. This is assumed. If you want to be very, very explicit, hey, I want you to automatically calculate 3 rows. You can do that. And you will see that sometimes. Of, hey, just visually, there are 3 rows here. There are 2 columns. There's a little bit of gap between them. And inside of each of these grids, I'm going to have a subgrid. Whatever's on the left, go from position 1 to position 2. No problem. That's defined. That's assumed. But where do I really change things up? With this row. If I didn't have this here, then they would all be even rows. But what I'm saying right now is go from, on the row side of things, 1 all the way to 4. This is row 1, 2, 3, and then 4 at the bottom. It takes a little bit of practice, but this is where the Chrome DevTools are just really, really helpful. But as you start thinking about the page that I want, how many columns do I want? How many rows do I want? Do I want everything to be the same? Or do I want things to start being different? That's where Grid can really help you out. And the good news is, even in our little demo right here with our new ways demo, it's really barely any code. This is all I have. The gap is optional. It's just for visual appearance, but it really is just display grid and then how many columns? How do you want those columns? You can play around with it. What would it look like if I did this? What would it look like if I did this? This is the same, obviously, as doing 1, 2. They're just fractions at the end of the day. If I don't have the grid, if I do have the grid, what do things look like? So you can click on this to get that really nice visual appearance of what does the grid look like at this point in time. And that is gold for just trying to develop some kind of spatial awareness of how many rows do I have? How many columns do I have? This right here is row 4. And under that, there's nothing else. So if I want this one to span more than one row, well, then I can start changing things. Grid row, start from 1, go to 4. And here, this is now taking that much space. The height is the thing that is actually not showing it up right here. But if for that particular div, I'll just change the height so you can see that take up, a little bit more. Here's that kind of taking that up in terms of its content. So here's what it would look like if I had this particular layout. The first column goes from 1 until 4 on the rows. And here's what I have. So if you want some really long sidebar, or maybe you don't like this layout, so you want to take out the grid gap, maybe even on all these divs, you want to take out the margin, maybe we'll just add a tiny bit of gap in the grid so that it doesn't look so jammed. And you want this really nice sidebar, so we're going to make that a little bit smaller. So maybe we'll do 1 FR and then 5 FR. And then this first thing is going to take up just the left-hand side. And then I can continue on, or maybe for these columns, maybe I don't even care about them. So here's what my layout looks like. And, I can change the height so that it's not exactly 100%. I can make sure it kind of lines up a little bit more nicely. So here is, a little example of you might have some kind of sidebar here. That sidebar has a bunch of things. Your columns are over here. Maybe for some reason, this particular column, well, where does it start on the column side of things? Grid column. I think this starts at 2 and it goes until the end. Okay. What if it goes from 2 until 4? Well, nope, 4 is going to be the end. So let's go ahead and change. Start this from 2, go until 3. And start this one from 2, go until 3 as well. So you can play around with the position and order of these as well. This goes from 2 until 3. You can go ahead back to this. You can change the layout, how many columns you want for these particular pieces. So it really all gives you flexibility at the end of the day for where do you want elements in your grid, where do you want to position them. But you can see with relative ease and a little bit of practice, set up however many columns you want, specify how many rows they span, and that's it. Grid containers and the FR unit, what you're going to see very, very, very commonly, the fraction unit. If you want your children to span multiple rows, multiple columns, you can use the grid column syntax that I showed you. That's kind of start at 1, go till 4, start at 2, go till 3. You can also use a keyword called span, or you can use something called grid area. These all do the same thing. get comfortable with this one first. So if you've used grid before and you're like, cool, I feel good about that, awesome. Look at spans, look at grid areas. But right now, just start with grid column and grid row. That's going to be plenty for now. Like we saw, 1-3 means start at column 3, end at column 3. Grid row, start at row 1, end at row 3. You can use -1 as well to mean the end if you don't know the number, or if you just want to be 100% confident, just always go until the end. An alternative to the number 1/3 is to use grid columns, the span keyword. Span 2 column lengths. As I change this, it doesn't make a difference. But let's say I have a couple more columns. I'll just add a 4-column layout. Span 1 column, span 2 columns, span 3 columns, span 4 columns. So that is the span keyword. Until you get comfortable with these numbers, like what 1-4, 1-2, 1-3, what that actually means, 1-1, I wouldn't jump to the span keyword. I'd really try to just make sure you understand the numeric piece first. There are lots of fancy syntax pieces you can use. Start at column 2, start spanning 2, and then take up an additional 2 columns. But I really would prefer the kind of numeric syntax as well. If you do something like -1 span, it doesn't really work like that. You kind of have to do something like take up 2 and span 2, but you can't really do that with -1 because there isn't really a reference to the end. So if you want that flexibility, it's you can hypothetically start from the end, go to and span 3. You can do that with negative numbers, but negative numbers don't really work as well with that piece. So -1 is really just a nice way to do that with this syntax right here. The other option that you have is something called grid area. And I'll show this to you, but I really don't think it is terribly worth it to get into right now. I added a bunch of borders so you can kind of see what's going on. Maybe I have a layout where I have the header that takes up the whole width, and then I have a sidebar that takes up this much, and then a main section that takes this much, and then a footer section that takes this much. The way that I've done this using grid area looks like this. Again, this is all boilerplate. This right here, with the exception of this, obviously I got to get the style sheet. This is the grid container. So nothing changes there. I still have a grid, I still have columns. But here, I have the area. Column 1, row 1, header. Column 2, row 2, column 2, row 1, column 3, row 1, header, header, header. Row 2, column 1, sidebar. Main, main. You can kind of think of this if you've worked with JavaScript like an array of arrays. Kind of like a matrix of sort. Take up the whole row with the header. If I added this piece right here, I would essentially be giving myself another entire row of sidebar and main. So I'd have to essentially include that again. And there I'd see another list of that sidebar and main. So what I'm basically saying is this is the first row, this is the second row, this is the third row, this is the first column, this is the second column. It can lead to some pretty cool layouts, but you're really kind of throwing a lot in here for what you're doing with your HTML. The second you add something, it might not behave as expected. So I would not jump to it just yet. But you might come across it as another way of laying out your grid. I find it a lot harder to work with by just naming parts of your grid especially when you're not super familiar with what's going on there. Because this thing right here actually makes a huge difference. If this all of a sudden says sidebar, now that changes. If that is the header, then everything changes. So you can really kind of shoot yourself in the foot by this ordering as well as the way your HTML looks. You can do some cool things with it, but I'd really just start with the numerical piece right off the bat. So you can use the name of your area and your grid template areas, but I would, again, this grid area syntax, this span syntax, this numerical syntax, they all do the same thing. So I'd really just start with that first piece and not worry too much about the span and grid area ideas. Again, just start with some basic layouts. Next time you look at a page, try to intuit the layout. Yeah, this looks like 2 columns, and it looks like in each of these, there are 2 columns. So it's kind of like a subgrid. And then here, I've got how many rows? 1, 2, 3, and then going from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4. And this is spanning from 1 until 4. That's how I got that layout. You can lay out things quite nicely just with this kind of grid interface. Flexbox is what we used to use to do layouts for a bit, but it really is not ideal for laying out things on the page. So where does Flexbox fit in? If you want spaces between elements, and if you have boxes that are not the same size, or you don't have an even sized grid, literally when you need boxes to be flexible. Navigation bars, very commonly, where you'll see Flexbox being used. Centering things vertically and horizontally. Flexbox is great for that. Flexbox has quite a few properties. They sound relatively confusing, but you're actually not going to use too many of them. So I'm going to show you an example of a nav bar that I have here. I'm going to show you what all of this does. By default, here's what things look like. I have a bunch of unordered lists, and I have list items inside. I have taken out the dots using CSS. And here's what I got so far. Display Flex will immediately put things in a row. If you want a different kind of flex layout, well, you can always click on this flex button, and you can say, the direction I want is not actually row, I want column. By default, flex is going to start with a direction of row. So it's always going to take something and just turn it into a row of stuff, which is why it's really good for a nav bar. If you want a column, sure, make it a column. You want a row in reverse? Great. You want a column in reverse? Go for it. If you have text that goes over, let's imagine I'm just going to take this text and I'm going to add something just ridiculously long here. If you have text that is overflowing, you can choose to wrap, or by default, we don't wrap. We just essentially go off the screen. So if you have text that is overflowing, you can choose to wrap it on to the next line or not. That's what Flex Wrap does for you. By default, we get that row. I'm just going to go and make this what it was before. So Flex Wrap. If you want to center things on the X axis, we have the justify content property. If I want to center things vertically, I'm just going to go ahead and add some height here. That is what align items does for me. In this case, my nav bar doesn't have much height, so centering vertically doesn't really do much for me. But if I had some more height and I wanted this to be centered on the x-axis and centered on the y. When you have a display of flex when things are in a row, Justify content vertically, align items horizontally. Justify content and align items to center horizontally and vertically. Center horizontally, center vertically. If things are in a row, no problem. If things are in a column, center vertically, center horizontally. So depending on whether you're dealing with a row or a column, justify content and align items will either center vertically or horizontally. You can obviously change these properties. You can set it with space around, space between, space evenly. So there's quite a bit you can do for the way that you want to center things. You can see how this might be nice for some kind of grid-like layout, but it actually becomes pretty hectic trying to lay things out in a grid with Flexbox. That's where grid is just a lot cleaner. So use Flex for centering horizontally and vertically, and when you need a little bit of space between things, that's where Flexbox can be quite helpful. You can choose to wrap. You can specify if you want space between. If you want some width or space between these elements, Flex Basis is a nice way to do that. But grid is really going to be your primary way of laying things out. Last little piece I want to talk about is the idea of responsive design. Responsive design consists of units that are fluid. So instead of fixed pixels, we have units that are fluid, media queries, which are kind of like breakpoints for when to determine certain rules, and then flexible images and media, making sure that we don't load images that are way too big or try to scale down images every time. That takes a while, that's expensive. If you haven't seen them before, media queries are a way to apply CSS based on a certain condition. I'll show you what that looks like. Here I'm going to say, if I want my grid to be responsive, if the width is at minimum 600, have a one column layout. What does that look like? Well, let's go take a look at our responsive grid. We can see here in this grid container that by default, repeat 1FR 4 times. As I scroll down, you can see that there is a media query that takes up what's going on. If it's at least 600 pixels and at most 1200 pixels, go back to a 2 layout. Once it gets to 600 and under, revert to one column. So if you want to start building pages that are responsive and you want essentially the equivalent of an if statement for your CSS, media queries are the way to go. And that's how you can make your grids responsive. If you want it to be 4 columns, no matter the size of the screen, which is not great, you can do that. But as I resize, we'll see these kind of media queries take over. I'll just show you what that CSS looks like. It's this right here. If this is true, if it is at most 600 pixels, go lean on this. If it's at least 600 pixels and at most 1200 pixels, go do this. All other times, go do this. It's kind of like an if, else if, and an else statement. We do that using what's called a media query. Last thing I want to talk about, to make your images more flexible. You probably haven't seen this before, and it's probably not a concern of yours yet, but it's a really good thing to dig into. There are 2 attributes you can add to the IMG or image tag. SRC or source set and sizes. Here's a nice little table. Again, we'll send out these slides and demos to you. SRC set allows you to basically specify a whole bunch of different images. Sizes allows you to tell the browser which one of those images to use when the screen is a certain size. So you use these in conjunction. SRC set you use to say, here are 4 different images, only load one of them. How do you know which one to load? Specify it with this sizes. Here's what that looks like. I have an image that by default uses this 200 by 200 pixels. I'm then saying, here are the 4 options you have for loading these images. Here are all the different options. Don't load all of them right now. Only load one. How do you determine which one to load? Well, if we go up to 600 pixels, load the 200 one. If we go up to 800 pixels, load the 400 one. If we go up to 1600 pixels, load the 800 one. Otherwise, load the 1600 one. This is a really, really, really powerful idea because you only make the browser load one image. You don't make the browser try to load images and scale them down or use conditional logic or JavaScript to determine which image to load. This makes image loading, which is usually a very, very expensive thing, much, 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 much faster. And this does not require any JavaScript, any CSS. This is no media queries or anything. So instead of doing things like, if the media fits this size, load this background image, you still might load all of those images, which can be really inefficient. So this is a slightly more modern way to be really, really cognizant of what images am I loading. The reason for this is mostly on mobile devices, especially with slower connections, 2G or 3G. You don't want to load a gigantic image. That's going to take seconds to load. And that's just going to kill all the performance of your web application. Again, not something to be terribly concerned about with at this moment, but it's a really good thing to dig into as you get more comfortable with design, responsiveness, and so on. So SRC set. Here are all the available options. Here is the natural dimensions of this image. And here are the rules I'd like you to apply for which one to load. This avoids the need to load things on a large screen, use CSS, use JavaScript. This is a huge, huge, huge win for making web applications faster. Lots of nice resources here. CSS Tricks is a fantastic guide, not as up-to-date as it used to be, but it's still a really wonderful way to learn all the things about CSS Grid. It can get really, really intense really quickly. You can look at this, be like, oh my God, where do I even begin? The Chrome DevTools, I think, are nicer than this, but if you just need kind of a basic way to get up and running, this is a good start. Same with Flexbox. And then if you want to look at SRC and SRC set, you can take a look at this nice article on MDN for ways to specify those things. So SRC set, sizes as well. Switching different sizes. Here's how we can do that. So same kind of idea. Load a bunch of different images and specify some rules for which one to load. If you would like to learn more, we don't cover as much CSS in this, but we'll send out some more information about other meetups and events that we have. We have a free 4-night private prep course. This is for folks interested in our coding bootcamp. If you want to get up to speed on some more of the advanced ideas in JavaScript, take a look at that. You can always find out what's happening with events and so on, and check us out on socials. That's all I got for you, team. A brief introduction to Grid and Flexbox. Again, there's a lot to dig into here, but lean on the Chrome DevTools as much as you can. If you're not comfortable with that, watch a YouTube video. Chrome also has wonderful tutorials for just how to download, how to get up to speed. It's a really, really, really nice place to kind of look into things.